Hello folks, I want to talk to you about reflexes in this video. And just thinking about the learning outcomes for this, I want you to be able to classify any of the reflexes that we study as being spinal or cranial reflex, being a somatic or a visceral reflex. And so that's kind of what we'll talk about here, but also to be able to draw a simple reflex arc, just a sort of generalized reflex arc, spinal reflex arc, but also specifically a stretch receptor or muscle reflex arc. So we'll talk about those two things primarily in this video. Okay, so here we are just showing classification of reflexes. There are a variety of reflexes, some of which are, and we can classify them in different ways. We're really only going to focus on those that are innate. So these are genetically determined, although we can improve certain reflexes like response reflexes. And we'll actually kind of do that in a lab example. We're just going to focus on those that are genetically determined. So they're innate reflexes. We will talk about two different types in terms of response, those that are somatic. So in that, that means that skeletal muscle is the effector. And we'll talk about those that are visceral, and that means that any of the visceral effectors, right, that visceral motor neurons connect to could be involved. So these could be glands, this could be fat cells, this could be heart muscle, it could be smooth muscle. And then we'll talk about simple reflexes just as an example, and polysynaptic, so monosynaptic versus polysynaptic, and that just refers to how many synapses are there in the reflex arc. And really the only one that we'll think about for the monosynaptic reflex, and there are not a lot of these, but these are spinal reflexes that are so critical for survival, so critical to prevent damage to the body, that there's only a single synapse in there. And that just means that, you know, no matter the strength of the stimulus, the response has always got to be the same in order to keep our bodies healthy and maintaining homeostasis. And then I mentioned we'll talk about the difference between spinal reflexes, where the processing is just happening in the spinal cord, versus cranial reflexes, where the process is happening in the brain. And then we'll talk about, when we get to cranial reflexes, we'll talk about the type of nerves or the different cranial nerves that are involved in each of those cranial reflexes. So for us, we're really thinking just about innate. And then for now, in this lecture, we're just going to talk about the somatic, spinal, and mostly monosynaptic, but we'll also get into a polysynaptic and show some examples of polysynaptic reflexes. Okay, so here's a simple reflex arc. And the reason to show you this is to show you that there's always these kind of 5 steps in a reflex arc, okay? This is what I'm showing you here, and what's pictured here is a spinal reflex arc. It's only taking place in the spinal cord, doesn't involve the brain. It's a somatic reflex arc in that skeletal muscles are the effectors, right? And it's innate, so it's genetically programmed. There's not really any variability, and there isn't any improvement or over time, right? Okay. So the steps in this process of a reflex arc. First is the stimulus arrives, right? So, and a receptor is activated. Now this receptor, sometimes we'll see that receptors are sensory neurons themselves. Those that have free nerve endings can actually be the receptor. More often, the receptor is actually a modified cell, often of epithelial tissue, sometimes connective tissue, but usually it's a modified epithelial tissue cell or epithelial cell that connects very quickly to a sensory neuron. Right? So in this case, this is just showing the sensation, or sorry, the stimulus is arriving and it's stimulating some receptor. The second part is when that receptor communicates with the sensory neuron, right? And so this is where sensation of the stimulus occurs. So part 2 is really sensation or activation of a sensory neuron. You could see here, right? What type of neuron is this? In terms of looking at this, unipolar, right? This is a unipolar sensory neuron with its cell body in the dorsal root ganglia. Here it is synapsing in the somatic region of the dorsal gray matter, okay, the sensory region. Now this is showing that it's connecting to a relay or interneuron, and that neuron is doing a couple things. In this case, it's communicating with a motor neuron. Look at that. And what kind of neuron is this, right? Hopefully you remember this is a motor neuron, so it's a giant multipolar neuron. So it's connecting to a motor neuron. It's also, in this case, taking that information up to the brain, right? So this axon collateral is jumping out here, in this case to the opposite side of the spinal cord, and it's traveling up through white matter, right? So this is all myonated here, so it can go very rapidly. It's going up through white matter to the brain so that the brain can learn about what just happened, right? But all the processing and determining of what should we do about this stimulus, that's happening right here. That's it, right? It's really simple. Now, in a lot of cases, there are often multiple sensory neurons actually involved in sensing this, and multiple motor neurons involved in stimulating muscle to respond. But diagrammatically, this is more or less the steps that are involved and the number of neurons that are involved in the process. Okay, so information processing, that's the third step. And there's the information processing, right? Stimulation of this cell, stimulation of the next cell. This is the response here really begins with number 4. So activation of a motor neuron, right? Stimulation of a motor neuron is the 4th step. Then that action potential propagates out. And finally, stimulation and response of the effector. So the excitation, contraction, coupling, since we're talking about skeletal muscle here, excitation, contraction, coupling between this motor neuron and all the muscle cells that it contacts, right? So this entire motor unit. And the final thing there, the response, is the contraction of the effector, in this case, the skeletal muscle. So these are the 5 steps, and this is more or less invariable no matter what type of reflex we're talking about. This specifically, though, is a spinal reflex arc, and it's a somatic reflex arc. Okay. One way to think about this, since we've sort of talked about a variety of ways in which we maintain homeostasis in terms of muscle tissue, bone, we talked about maintaining homeostasis of the skin, the integrity of the skin. This is another way of maintaining homeostasis of the body, keeping the body safe from harm, right? So we preserve homeostasis via negative feedback loops in this case. So you'll notice what we have here is stimulation, right? So there's this stimulus, in this case, is sitting on a tack or coming down on a tack. So that is the stimulus. Remember, a negative feedback loop, it works well. In a negative feedback loop, the effector tries to reduce or reverse the direction of the stimulus. So the stimulus is this increasing pain by leaning on a tack. So of course the effector is going to behave in ways to reduce that pain, right? And this is the withdrawal reflex that's being shown here. Okay. All right. So let's look at a couple of reflexes. Actually, we'll save this one for the next lecture. That's our sort of overview of reflexes. Then the next video actually shows this monosynaptic stretch reflex, and then we'll follow that up with a video that shows a polysynaptic reflex, so a little bit more complex wiring, but just sort of picking up where this monosynaptic stretch reflex leaves off. And I think the last thing I'll say, just as an intro to that next video, is in these monosynaptic stretch reflexes, right? We have only one synapse. That's what mono is, one. So monosynaptic, we just have the sensory neuron communicating with the motor neuron. Now, typically this will also contact another neuron, often an inhibitory neuron, only to increase the intensity of the reflex. But we would still say it's monosynaptic because what we lack is a relay neuron. There is no interneuron in this case. Okay. All right. Please let me know if you have questions about this. I'll see you in our next video.